everyone, welcome to WION Live broadcast from New York City. First, let's take a look at this hour's headlines before we go straight into our first story. G7 leaders are set to agree on a new $50 billion loan for Ukraine as they gather for a summit in southern Italy, using the profits from frozen Russian assets. The Kremlin, asked about U.S. nervousness about Russian warships visiting Cuba, says there's no reason for any country, including the United States, to be worried by this exercise. The UK announces dozens of new sanctions aimed at constraining Russia's war in Ukraine, including targeting Moscow's main stock exchange, a day after Washington announced similar measures. Israeli helicopters strike Gaza's Rafah, according to residents, with Hamas militants saying street battles in the southern city have erupted after top U.S. diplomat Antony Blinken said a truce is still possible. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hails Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez for his stance on the Gaza war, which has seen the Spanish leader emerging as an outspoken critic of Israel. And Wimbledon will have a record prize money pool of $63.94 million this year. That's almost 12% more than what was offered at last year's tournament. The singles champions will take home $3.45 million each. The group of 7 leaders have arrived in southern Italy to discuss issues dominating the world. Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas wars are expected to take center stage during the scheduled 3 days of talks. In the latest, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni joined for leaders for a group photo shoot ahead of the summit. Meloni could be seen flanked by Macron and Biden in the group photo lineup. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has departed from Delhi and is expected to reach Italy for his 5th consecutive participation in the summit of the world's most economically advanced nations later today.
We will of course talk about ongoing crises, starting with Ukraine and the Middle East. We will build on the work of the Japanese presidency, advancing on the need to create robust and controllable supply chains on what is probably the most complex challenge of our time, which is the advent of generative artificial intelligence clearly, with the need to seize its opportunities while governing its risks.
There have been multiple substantial developments leading up to this meeting. To begin with, on the eve of the summit, the U.S. has expanded its sanctions on Russia. They were announced just as U.S. President Joe Biden was leaving for Italy. Biden is also planning a push for frozen Russian assets to help rebuild Ukraine. G7 leaders have agreed to lend Ukraine $50 billion backed by those foreign assets, frozen ones. Not only this, Biden and Zelensky are set to sign a 10-year U.S.-Ukraine security deal at the summit. UK's Rishi Sunak is also set to announce up to $309 million in support for Ukraine's energy and humanitarian needs. Also expected to be on the agenda at the G7 summit are the wars in Gaza, migration, economic security, and artificial intelligence. Separately, Pope Francis is set to become the first pontiff to attend a G7 summit. He will be addressing the subject of artificial intelligence at this conference. He has previously called for global regulations of AI, warning of its dangers to ethics and human rights. The summit, however, comes with its own uncertainties, as many leaders, including Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, and Joe Biden, face electoral challenges back home. Sunak is down in the polls ahead of a general election next month. Macron is also set to face voters after he called a snap parliamentary elections following a resounding loss in the European elections. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Joe Biden similarly face a tough battle the next time voters head to the polls. All right, for more details on the G7, our correspondent Valentina Di Donato has sent us this report from Bari in Italy.
Absolutely. As you can see, I'm here in Bari and we're teeming with tourists. This is a touristic destination, and that is part of why Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has chosen this region as the place to host some of the world's most powerful leaders. And it is a region that the sense on the ground is that they're happy. They're happy that these leaders are here. It's a point of pride. And their hope is that the name of the region continues to bring more tourism, money. And Meloni also decided to bring leaders here, in part because during the pandemic, the EU was able to give the region a lot of money. And so I think she wants to also showcase how that money, the EU funds, are being put to use. A lot has been built, and the luxury hotel where all of these leaders are staying, it's sort of a representation of what that is. And despite all of this, we're on the backdrop of an incredible win for the extreme right with Giorgia Meloni, and she is basking in this moment.
And for more, we have Alexander Claxon, political analyst and founder of Global Political Insight think tank, joining us live from London. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. What can we expect from the G7 meeting, given the Russia-Ukraine war's prominent focus? And additionally, considering new sanctions being announced by the United States and the UK as well, do you think that they'll have a significant impact on Russia, or will Moscow find ways to circumvent them once again, as they have done with previous sanctions?
Hi there. So in relation to your first question, the priority for the G7 countries will be to show unity on the key topics on the agenda. As you mentioned in your report, there's been so many political changes taking place within the G7, and many changes are to be expected as well, with the American elections coming up, French elections coming up, and of course the UK elections as well. So we might see many different leaders in the coming months emerging in the G7. So the focus for them right now is to show that they are at the moment united as to how they approach the major conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Israel and Palestine. In relation to your second question, it is a headache for Russia, these new sanctions, because essentially they aim to prevent third parties from doing business with Russia. And in fact, over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to circumvent the sanctions regime through working with third parties. Nevertheless, as we have seen over the past 2 years, Russia has been quite good at managing these situations. And I would expect that these new sanctions will not have a significant impact on the war itself, and also on the Russia's economy as well, because the Russia's economy has managed to navigate these sanctions and essentially become a war economy, using the war to actually prop up and grow its economy.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, India has been invited to the G7 summit as an outreach country. Prime Minister Modi is on his way to Italy as we speak. What issues do you think he'll raise at this gathering?
Well, the interesting point here is that India's position on the war in Ukraine doesn't really match to the position of the G7, because looking at the strategy of the G7, they essentially want to prolong this conflict for as long as possible by supporting Ukraine militarily and financially, whilst the position of India is diplomacy and negotiations. So I would expect the Indian delegation to, first of all, try and promote this idea that perhaps the war in Ukraine should end through negotiations rather than this continuous supply of weapons and the financial support to Ukraine. And the second aspect is, of course, bilateral relations. Narendra Modi, as you know, just won his re-election just recently, so he will want to shore up India's cooperation with the G7 countries, and I'm sure he will essentially be carrying out bilateral meetings with all the leaders of the G7 to establish new economic cooperation and enhance the ties that already exist.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that thorough analysis, Alexander Claxton, joining us from London. We're going to be following this story very closely, of course, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you.
Charity Oxfam urges wealthy nations to boost spending on ending hunger as G7 leaders meet in Italy, saying that just 3% of the G7 military spending could help solve the global food and debt crisis. Our next report has all the details.
The raging war in Ukraine has left cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut in ruins, with countless lives lost. Millions are displaced following the widespread destruction of homes, hospitals, and infrastructure has created a dire humanitarian crisis. While Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities, the West is pumping in billions of dollars. But it is all meant for weapons to help the Ukrainian troops. On the other hand, Israeli strikes have reduced Gaza to ruins. Hamas claims over 37,000 Palestinians have been killed. The UN says a large portion of the population in Gaza is facing catastrophic hunger and famine-like conditions. According to the latest UN report, the number of people forcibly displaced stood at a record 117.3 million till the end of last year. But all this can change. Charity Oxfam has urged wealthy nations to boost spending on ending global hunger. As the Group of 7 annual summit begins in Italy, Oxfam's striking claim is that just 3% of G7 military spending could help solve the global food and debt crisis. Reallocating a small portion of military budgets could not only combat hunger and debt, but also contribute to global stability. The redirection of resources could offer a lifeline to millions suffering from food insecurity and crippling debt, presenting a more balanced and humanitarian approach to global governance. The collapse of Western relations with China and the intensifying US-China competition has intensified global instability. Major powers often dispute diplomatic approaches to crises, hindering collective efforts to address them effectively. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
U.S. lawmakers have passed a bipartisan legislation enhancing U.S. support for Tibet. This could become another flashpoint in the already strained U.S.-China ties. The Resolve Tibet Act helps counter the Chinese government's misinformation about Tibet. The act promotes dialogue between Beijing and the Dalai Lama towards a peaceful resolution of the long-standing dispute between Tibet and China. The Resolve Tibet Act first passed the House last February and cleared the Senate last month. The House of Representatives voted 391 to 26 in the final procedural vote. It now goes to President Biden's desk, who is expected to sign it into law. The act empowers the State Department officials to actively and directly counter disinformation about Tibet. It rejects claims of China that Tibet is part of China since ancient times. The legislation pushes for negotiations without preconditions between the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama or his representatives or the democratically elected leaders of the Tibetan community. It affirms the State Department's responsibility to coordinate for a negotiated agreement. No formal dialogue between Tibetan and Chinese authorities has happened since 2010, and according to lawmakers who presented the bill, Chinese officials continue to make unreasonable demands of the Dalai Lama as a condition for further dialogue. By hardening the language around Washington's stance on Tibet, backers of the bill hope to bring Beijing back to the negotiating table with the Dalai Lama. Beijing argues that Tibet has remained under central Chinese rule for over 700 years, despite extended periods in which Tibetan campaigners argue that the region was effectively self-governed. The Dalai Lama has said that he does not seek political independence for Tibet, but has not recognized Beijing's historical claim over Tibet. In April, China reasserted that any contact or talks with the Dalai Lama would concern his personal future or at most that of his close associates and not the question of Tibetan autonomy. U.S. President Joe Biden is yet to meet Dalai Lama since taking office in 2021. He, however, expressed sympathy for the Tibetan cause and has raised the issue with Xi Jinping in the past. U.S. has also appointed a high-ranking State Department official to serve as special coordinator for Tibetan issues. There are reports that Dalai Lama may visit the United States this month for a knee treatment, but it is not clear if he will be meeting any U.S. officials.
Emotional and generation.
Mr. President, have you seen the interagency report?
Emotional and generation.
From the bustling trading floors of Wall Street to the vibrant exchanges of Asian stock markets, WION breaks it down for you to make sense of what's happening, as we reveal the key factors behind events, strategic battles, and the game-changing business decisions that shape the world. We bring you all of this and more on World Business Watch. This week's episode of our special series, Yoga, celebrating India's gift to mankind, brought to you from the beautiful state of Kerala in southern India. We explore an Ayurvedic retreat in Palakkad and tell you all about the power of the Indian traditional medicine system.
We want our Indian community to take the benefit of our local medicine.
What happens when ancient India meets artificial intelligence? From smart yoga mats to yoga apps at your fingertips, we look at the rise of AI in yoga. Watch our special series at this time, only on WION. World is One.
WION Health Resort is unique, the only one of its kind. Experience the 4 paths of natural wellness: yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy. Each uniquely customized program improves the whole person to make every person whole. Come to WION Health Resort. Make your reservation at wion.com.
Following an intense 3-day siege by armed gunmen in Mexico's Tila, over 4,000 residents have now fled the town in fear. Once relatively untouched by cartel violence, the region has seen some 5,000 army troops deployed in the wake of this siege. As lawlessness mounts in the country, our next report explores how the Mexican state is responding, if at all.